Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, published in 1813, is a beloved classic of English literature that tells the story of the Bennet family and their search for love and marriage in early 19th century England. The novel is set in the fictional town of Meryton in Hertfordshire and primarily revolves around the second eldest daughter of the Bennet family, Elizabeth Bennet. The Bennet family consists of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and their 5 daughters, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. As per the social norms of the time, the family's estate is entailed to a male relative, meaning that the daughters are without a substantial inheritance and must marry well to secure their futures. The story begins when a wealthy young bachelor named Mr. Charles Bingley, along with his haughty friend Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, move into a nearby estate called Netherfield. The Bennet sisters are eager to meet the newcomers, and at a local ball, Jane forms an immediate connection with Mr. Bingley. However, Mr. Darcy's aloof and proud demeanor earns him the disdain of the locals, including Elizabeth, who overhears him making unflattering remarks about her at the ball. As the story progresses, Jane and Mr. Bingley's relationship seems to blossom, but the influence of Mr. Darcy and his sister Georgiana, who disapprove of the match due to Jane's lower social standing, leads to Mr. Bingley abruptly leaving for London, breaking Jane's heart. Meanwhile, Elizabeth becomes acquainted with Mr. Darcy's character through her interactions with him and his involvement with her family. She is, at first, deeply prejudiced against him due to his supposed arrogance and snobbery. However, as she learns more about him and the circumstances behind his actions, her opinion begins to change. Elizabeth's prejudices are further fueled when she meets Mr. George Wickham, a charming officer with whom Mr. Darcy seems to have a long-standing dispute. Wickham shares a tale of mistreatment at Darcy's hands, leading Elizabeth to believe him and further cementing her negative view of Mr. Darcy. Despite her initial dislike, Mr. Darcy finds himself increasingly attracted to Elizabeth's wit and intelligence. He eventually proposes to her, but his prideful manner and the revelation of his involvement in Jane and Mr. Bingley's separation cause Elizabeth to vehemently reject him, convinced she is making the right decision. Following this, a series of events unfold that reveal the true character of both Darcy and Wickham. Mr. Darcy writes Elizabeth a letter explaining his side of the story, shedding light on Wickham's deceit and revealing the truth about his actions regarding Jane and Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth's feelings towards Mr. Darcy begin to change as she recognizes her own prejudices and misjudgments. When Elizabeth and her aunt and uncle visit the grand estate of Pemberley, they encounter Mr. Darcy again, but this time he presents himself in a much more amiable light. As their paths continue to cross, Elizabeth starts to develop feelings for him. At the same time, the scandalous elopement of Lydia with Mr. Wickham puts the Bennet family's reputation in jeopardy. Mr. Darcy, realizing how much he loves Elizabeth, takes it upon himself to resolve the situation and save the Bennet family from disgrace. He convinces Wickham to marry Lydia, securing her future. With this act of kindness and selflessness, Mr. Darcy wins the admiration and gratitude of Elizabeth and her family. The barrier of pride and prejudice that had separated them finally crumbles, and Elizabeth comes to understand the true nature of Mr. Darcy's character. In the end, love conquers all, and Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy overcome their pride and prejudices to find happiness together. The novel concludes with the union of Jane and Mr. Bingley and Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, bringing a satisfying and heartwarming conclusion to this delightful tale of love, societal expectations, and the growth of individual characters in Pride and Prejudice.